Because I'm thrilled that we're being able to provide it in a multilingual setting in English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. And so welcome, everyone, and thank you again for being here. Um, Barbara, Kathy, and I are three attorneys from Sanctuary for Families Anti-Trafficking Initiative. And if you're not already familiar with Sanctuary for Families, it is New York's largest service provider and advocate for survivors of domestic violence, sex trafficking, and other forms of gender-based violence. In other words, violence that targets someone because of their gender. We provide comprehensive services ranging from shelter, counseling for adults and children, legal advice and representation in orders of protection, victim witness cooperation, family law, custody, divorce, and immigration law, and economic empowerment programs designed to help survivors move into living wage jobs. As a nonprofit, all of our services are free, and we partner with other nonprofit service providers across New York to make sure that our clients have access to a diverse array of services. Over the past 5 years, Sanctuary for Families has served over 2,000 survivors of trafficking. So today we're here to share some information based on our experience in working with survivors of trafficking. It can be difficult to identify trafficking, especially if it's happening to you. And it often comes in forms that we may not recognize as trafficking. But by the end of this presentation, you will understand what trafficking is, what common trafficking patterns look like that we encounter in New York, and what legal protections are available if you or someone you know is a victim of trafficking. Next slide, please. So just take a moment and pause here to provide a trigger warning. Some topics or examples that we're providing later in the presentation could be triggering. So feel free at any time to take a break or leave the webinar, come back or not come back. And I encourage you all to engage in self-care during and or after this webinar. Okay, next slide, please. So first, let's talk about what trafficking actually is. Human trafficking is the third largest criminal industry in the world behind drugs and arms trafficking. Yes, we can provide the slides. Thank you, Anna, for asking. And so some folks wonder, how could trafficking be on the rise and be just behind drugs and arms trafficking? And when you think about it, and what makes this one of the largest growing criminal enterprises is human bodies can be consumed over and over and over and over again. According to UNODC Global Report on Human Trafficking, female victims continue to be particularly affected by trafficking in persons. In 2018, for every 10 victims detected globally, about 5 were adult women and 2 were girls. Worldwide, almost 20% of all trafficking victims are children. The most common form of human trafficking, 60%, is sexual exploitation. The victims of sexual exploitation are predominantly women and girls. So trafficking can be a really loaded term, and we often associate trafficking with very graphic, violent images that we may see in mainstream media. For example, you may think that in order to be a trafficking victim, you must have been tied up or beaten, or you must have been an undocumented immigrant smuggled into the United States by someone else. But in reality, trafficking is not always such a black and white situation. At its heart, trafficking is about control, the abuse of power or position of vulnerability, and pressuring somebody to provide commercial sex or some kind of labor service, and then profiting off that non-consensual act. There is no need to cross international lines. For example, someone can be born in New York City, raised in New York City, never leave in New York City, and then trafficked in New York City without having left. Anyone can be a victim of trafficking. A child, adult, male, female, trans, non-binary immigrant, or a US citizen. The key is whether the type of pressure used by the trafficker crosses over into the line of trafficking. On one extreme, yes, a trafficker may tie up and beat a trafficking victim in order to force her to provide sexual services. However, a trafficker may choose to use more subtle forms of coercion. For example, a trafficker may pressure a trafficking victim by emotionally abusing them, by threatening them due to lack of their immigration status, by taking away their passport or other identification documents, or by tricking them into high amounts of purported debt. All of those situations do not necessarily involve physical violence, force, or imprisonment, but they still may cross into the line of trafficking. Next slide, please. Under US federal law, there are two main categories of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. There's also state level laws in New York City. We have our own anti-trafficking laws, and there's also an international definition called the Palermo Protocol. Since we're generally functioning under US law, especially when we're working with immigration law, we tend to look at this definition. To keep things simple, we'll just look at this definition in this presentation. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act was passed in 2000 and provides these definitions. And we'll start with labor trafficking. So labor trafficking is when someone is induced to provide labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion, rising to the level of either involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. What is involuntary servitude, debt bondage, peonage, or slavery? The key is whether the trafficker causes the victim to believe that they must provide that labor or service, or else they will suffer serious negative consequences, which can range from financial consequences like defaulting on debt, legal consequences like being reported to the police or immigration enforcement, or physical consequences like beatings, imprisonment, or death. Sex trafficking is when a person is induced to perform a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. And actually, that's the definition of a severe form of human trafficking under the federal law. So what's a commercial sex act? A commercial sex act is when something of value is exchanged for the sex act. And that can be money, but isn't always. It can be shelter, food, drugs, or some other benefit. Force, fraud, and coercion are key in determining whether the circumstances rise to the level of trafficking. As we discussed previously, traffickers can use a variety of different tactics that range from direct physical violence or force to deception and tricks, to financial and immigration-related threats. An important thing to note here is that if the victim is under 18 years old, there doesn't need to be force, fraud, or coercion. Any kind of inducement of a minor to perform a commercial sex act is de facto trafficking. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about power and control tactics that traffickers use to gain this position of power over their victims. This is what's called a power and control wheel. We first started to see this in the context of the domestic violence field, and it was used as a tool that helps to explain the different ways an abusive partner can use power and control to manipulate a relationship. And oftentimes, social workers would use this wheel to work with their clients to help them recognize any warning signs that could be present in their own relationships. And so in the anti-trafficking space, the wheel has been adapted to demonstrate the power and control tactics that traffickers use to gain control over their victims. And in fact, a trafficker could be someone's intimate partner. In fact, many of my clients report that their trafficker is their boyfriend or the father of their children. And so I want to just take a little bit of a deeper dive into this power and control wheel. And so some of these factors may be present and some, or maybe all of them. And so we can just pick out a couple of these pie slices and just to look at them. So using family members, right? This is one I hear about a lot. So perhaps I'm working with a client that met her trafficker in her home country. This person purported to be her boyfriend and convinced her, why don't you leave your child with your mom? She'll be in great hands. Come with me to the United States. You'll be able to make money and give your daughter a better life. And in fact, when she arrives, she's been deceived and is forced into prostitution. And now at this point, the trafficker knows where her daughter is and uses that information to hold against her to induce her to perform a commercial sex act. So this is an example of using family members, threatening the person harm against someone that they love. The abuse can also be isolation, right? Bringing someone into the country who may not speak English or know how to access assistance or help or legal access, right? Keeping that person away from their family without a phone or without a lifeline to the people that they love and trust. And we'll see more of this as we go through some case examples, and we'll see these power and control dynamics really play out in the next couple of case studies. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through 4 case studies, and I'll just note that these are completely fabricated based on what we see as very typical patterns, but in respect for our clients, their confidentiality, none of these were taken from any one particular case. In fact, they represent more of an amalgamation of many different cases that we see that are particularly typical. So here is case study 1. Our client's name is Mandy. She is female and a Chinese national. She is 25 years old. In China, Mandy's mother was defrauded of more than $100,000 of debt. Her mom pressures Mandy to come to the US to work and help to repay her debts. While she's here, Mandy meets Jason through mutual friends, and they start messaging each other on WeChat. Jason tells Mandy he loves her. He's also a US citizen and wants to help her to take care of her and start a family. Jason persuades Mandy to work at an illicit massage business and provide sexual services to customers. He drives her to and from work and starts demanding to borrow money from her and is stealing money from his purse and beating her if she refuses. In the meantime, customers at the massage parlor often sexually harass Mandy, threaten her, and some attempt to rape her. The massage bosses say this is normal and you just need to deal with it to Mandy. Jason tells her, just focus on how much money you're making every day. Mandy is eventually arrested for prostitution and unlicensed practice of a profession or massage. Jason will not let her quit even after having been arrested. But when Mandy tells him she wants to stop, he beats her. Mandy thinks about calling the police, but Jason has always told her, you don't have status and I'm a citizen. If you call the police, you're the one who will end up deported. Mandy is terrified for her and her daughter's lives if they return to China. She never calls the police. So in hearing about this case study, ask yourself, who stands out as the trafficker? Who stands out as the exploiter? And what are some of the power and control factors that you were able to pick up in this fact pattern, right? So some of the more overt power and control factors is certainly what Jason is doing, right? He's controlling her movements. He drives her back and forth to the illicit massage business. He's physically beating her when she tries to resist. He threatens her with deportation. He's also manipulating her into believing that she doesn't have any rights because she is an immigrant and he is a US citizen. But also the folks exerting exploitation here are the massage bosses, right? Who are aware that customers are coming in and demanding sexual services. And when Mandy doesn't want to provide them, they downplay her concerns and they tell her, this is normal, this is just what you have to do, and you have to deal with it. Okay. Case study number 2. Lisa is a survivor who is Mexican citizen who was sex and labor trafficked by a trafficking family or ring over the span of 20+ decades. Lisa was lured to the US after meeting a man in a park who pretended to have romantic interest in her. He brings her to the United States with false promises of a job in a restaurant, and then he and a coyote smuggle Lisa into the US. But when she arrives, they take her documents. She was told she had a large debt to pay for her passage to the United States. The man she thought was her boyfriend and his brothers forced Lisa to work in various jobs to pay off her purported debt over the span of 20 years. including working at dollar dance clubs, having to drink and dance with men, doing domestic work such as cleaning, and in prostitution. Lisa lives with her trafficker, and on a regular basis, he rapes her and beats her if she tries to hide any money. He says he knows where her family lives. She was never told how much debt she had paid off, and the abuse progressed from debt bondage into involuntary servitude and sex trafficking. So here's another kind of typical pattern that we see. And think about, again, what are the power and control factors at play here, right? What is the force, fraud, and coercion here? So first, her trafficker tricked her into believing he was someone that cared about her. And we see this a lot with intimate partner traffickers, right? And really honing in on what that person's vulnerability is. And so, for example, the client or the survivor may express to the trafficker that they're feeling lonely and they were kicked out of their house or they never found love. And then that trafficker purports to love them and exploit that vulnerability and step in to fill that void. Right. And so in this case, this person who purports to be her boyfriend and who says that she'll get a great job in a restaurant and probably says you'll be able to send money home to your family has tricked her, because when she arrives, she's forced into trafficking schemes. And then the trafficker also uses other kinds of force: physical assault, beatings, rape. She's forced to live in their home and probably very isolated. The trafficker also frequently threatens Lisa's life and her mother and sister's life if she does not continue to work for them and, quote, pay back her debt, right? And this is something we also hear. Traffickers who know that a survivor has younger siblings will say, I'll make sure that your sister ends up being prostituted too. And so, of course, with this kind of coercion and control, a trafficker feels like she has to do this or else. Another thing is Lisa's never told how much debt she has to pay off, even though she inquires. And if she inquires too much, she's beaten. Lisa also doesn't have any form of ID in the United States. So her passport and her birth certificate were taken from her once she entered the country, and they don't give them back. So we think about that kind of isolation, not having your identity documents, not being able to speak the language or feel that you'd be believed if you could reach out for help. Case study number 3, Chelsea. Chelsea is a US citizen. She is 17 years old. She came to the United States and became a citizen when she was 5 years old. When she was in her home country, she was sexually abused by a relative as a toddler. She meets her trafficker through her classmate. Her trafficker was a few years older and already dating her classmate. However, he soon turned his attention to Chelsea. Her trafficker took her on lots of dates and showered her with affection. He began asking her to do small things for him, like shoplifting and small items from drugstores. Eventually, he told Chelsea he was going to take her on a trip to California, where she always wanted to go. Instead, he brings her to a series of hotel rooms in different states and drugs her, and then sends men in to rape her in exchange for money for his financial benefit. So it's important to note here that while there are power and control factors present, and they're fairly overt, we don't need under the law to demonstrate any force, fraud, or control because Chelsea is under 18. Right? And so even though we don't need to demonstrate under the law those factors, we can anyway, just to talk about them, right? So the trafficker creates this manufactured, again, intimate relationship with Chelsea and forms this romantic bond that he can use to manipulate her. Okay. Another aspect that we see pretty frequently too is using drugs to sedate and keep control over a victim. And in our last study, we'll talk about Helen. Helen is a female Chinese national who is 49 years old. Helen came to the United States and decided to stay and work to support her family. She cycled through a number of different jobs before answering a job ad she saw in a Chinese language newspaper. The job advertised high wages for a masseuse position. 2 traffickers drove Helen out of state to an area where she was unfamiliar, then booked her a hotel room and informed her that the customers would come into the room for massages. For safekeeping, they confiscated all the money she had on her person. First customer came into the room and raped Helen. When she tried to protest, the traffickers told her she had no choice but to stay until she made back the money they spent on advertising the job, transporting her out of state, and booking the room. The traffickers then shuttled Helen to motels and told her that all Chinese women in America do this work. And now that she had started, she couldn't go back. In addition, they confiscated the money paid by the customers. They let Helen go after 2 weeks, leaving her with only $20. Let's talk about some of the power and control factors here. Note that there's no direct violence from her traffickers. Instead, the traffickers use violence from the sex buyers, the customers, to break Helen down. They confiscate her money and take her to different states, disorienting her so that she's unable to escape. They use psychological manipulation by telling her that all Chinese women in America have to do this work and that she was already, quote, tainted for having been involved. So among these 4 case examples, you can really see, and if we could go just back to the previous slide real quick, we can really see how the dynamics that are shown on this power and control wheel, some of them may be at play, all of them may be at play, but you can really see the wide variety of how traffickers use power and control and abuse that power and control to force victims into the acts that they want to. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered what trafficking is, what kind of schemes look like, let's start to talk about what are your rights and what kind of legal remedies there are. So in the US, US immigration law is fairly strict, right? But there are a series of humanitarian forms of relief for folks who have been victims of crimes inside the United States or experienced persecution outside of the United States. And so when we're working with trafficking survivors, they may be eligible for one or more forms of relief. And part of an attorney consultation is figuring out what the client's goals are, what they'd like to achieve, and then figuring out what may be the best form of relief that they're eligible for. All right, so we've listed a couple here, and we'll go through all of them briefly, returning back to T non-immigrant status, otherwise known as the T visa, because that is the form of relief we work with most in the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families. So the T visa is really uniquely tailored for individuals that have experienced the crime of human trafficking inside the United States. And like I said, we'll elaborate on this later. A U visa, or U non-immigrant status, is for victims of certain crimes committed against them inside of the United States. They also have to collaborate with law enforcement to detect, investigate, or prosecute that crime. There are other eligibility prongs, but the main for us to understand about the U visa is that it's a certain set of crimes, which include, for example, trafficking, domestic violence, rape, etc. There's also something called a vow of self-petition for survivors of domestic violence when they are married to the perpetrator, who may also be a US citizen or a green card holder. And we think about this form of relief for some of our clients because, in fact, as I mentioned, many of our clients have experienced abuse at the hands of their intimate partner. Last is asylum for people that have suffered persecution or have a well-founded fear that they will suffer persecution in their home countries due to their race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular social group, or their political opinion. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look at T non-immigrant status. It's not the best visual here. We have part of the first page of an old edition of the I-914 application. And if you've applied for immigration benefits, you know that immigration sort of occurs on forms. Well, the I-914 is the form when someone is applying for T non-immigrant status. So that's the visual that we have here. It's the first page that asks for a lot of demographic information, et cetera. But basically, we're going to talk about who's eligible for T non-immigrant status. First prong is you have to demonstrate to the government that you are a victim of a severe form of sex trafficking or labor trafficking as specified under federal law. And if you remember earlier in the presentation, we looked at that slide that showed the definitions of labor and sex trafficking. Right? Second requirement, you have to show that you are present in the United States on account of that trafficking, and the trafficking took place in the US, right? Third is that you have to demonstrate cooperation with law enforcement, and that can be reporting to law enforcement. It may also include investigation or prosecution against your traffickers. There are two exceptions to that rule. One is if you're a minor, and the other is if you've experienced such severe trauma that you could not possibly cooperate with law enforcement. Okay. And the last and fourth requirement is that you would experience extreme hardship if you were removed and sent back to your home country. Okay. So what happens if you are approved for T non-immigrant status? What is it? What does it come with? And how does it help? So first of all, you're granted 4 years of status, and it's also a bridge for you to be able to apply for your green card or lawful permanent residency, right? And then after that, potentially US citizenship. It also comes with 4-year work authorization, and with that, you're able to get a Social Security number. One of the really great things about T non-immigrant status, or the T visa, is that you're able to apply for certain family members, whether they're in the United States or outside of the United States. So something we see typically, like I was mentioning earlier, is that we may have a client who was forced to leave their children in their home country. Well, with the T visa, that person is able to apply for their children, even if they're outside of the United States, and apply for them later to consular process if their T is approved to come and join mom in the United States. You can also apply for spouses. If the person is a minor, they can apply for unmarried minor siblings, parents. There's also another category for family members who are derivatives of derivatives, or who are experiencing imminent danger at the hands of traffickers who are perceiving, who are moving forward with retaliation. So one of the biggest benefits too is this family reunification aspect of T non-immigrant status. Also, once you receive T non-immigrant status, you receive a certification letter from the US government that says that you are certified and recognized as a survivor of human trafficking under US law. And that enables you to apply for all of the public benefits that would be available to a US citizen or refugee. And that includes food stamps, healthcare, cash assistance, SNAP, etc. So what happens if you're interested in applying for a T visa? Well, you would meet with an attorney, have a consultation, discuss eligibility, and whether or not this is the route you want to take. And if you decide with your attorney that you would like to apply for T non-immigrant status, here's what the timeline looks like. It's a long process. It is a difficult process. Having to ask a survivor to recount their story, to memorialize that in an affidavit is not easy. And all the attorneys on our team practice trauma-informed lawyering and really work in different ways and tailor the experience for each survivor's unique experience to ensure that not only we get excellent outcomes, but we ensure dignity and compassion through the process, knowing that this is really tough. Preparing that T visa takes anywhere between 6 months to a year, generally, depending on the complexity of the case, how many derivatives there are, what stage is the prosecution against the traffickers in, etc. Once the visa is filed, averaging processing times as of last month were ranging about 17 months. When I first started this work almost a decade ago, we used to file T visas and get them back in like 6 or 7 months. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. And during the pandemic, we saw adjudication times that ranged as long as 2 years. It was excruciating. Thankfully, we're starting to see shorter adjudication times because that we know for many of our clients who are undocumented, navigating the world without status until that time is really difficult. So as I mentioned, there are a host of benefits that go along with being identified by either New York State or the US government as a trafficking survivor. So some of those forms of social assistance can help with safety, protection, and general well-being. It can include housing assistance, food assistance, income assistance, employment assistance, English language training, healthcare, mental health services, perhaps foster care. So in New York in particular, New York State has its own program through the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance. If you've worked with us already, you may have allowed us to submit an OTDA referral form. And with that, if we can demonstrate to New York State that you are a trafficking survivor under New York State law or meet the federal definition within certain other eligibility prongs, New York State returns back a letter saying that you are recognized as a trafficking survivor in New York State, and that may entitle you to certain money or services. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm just gonna take a pause here. I know I'm going over a lot of information in a very short amount of time. And I know some of you may have questions, and I'll just reiterate that we are reserving a nice chunk of time at the end of the presentation back in the main room that we will be able to simultaneously translate into English, Spanish, and Mandarin. So if you do have any questions, feel free to write them down or pop them in the chat, and we can always address them later in the main room. Okay, so we've talked about some of the immigration remedies. Let's talk about criminal justice advocacy. So we have about 7 attorneys on our team at the Anti-Trafficking Initiative and Sanctuary for Families. And we all practice immigration law, but we also engage in criminal justice advocacy and representation for clients who are cooperating victim witnesses in state or federal investigations against their traffickers. So while our work very much focuses on immigration remedies, we also represent clients who want to report the crimes committed against them to law enforcement. And law enforcement could be NYPD, FBI, HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, a prosecutor's office, a state level prosecutor like a district attorney or a federal prosecutor and an assistant US attorney, okay? So we are going to be doing a part 2 of this webinar, and we'll take an even deeper dive into criminal justice advocacy for trafficking survivors. But I do want to give you sort of a general overview of the kind of remedies that we can assist with in ATI. Okay. So I started to talk about victim witness cooperation, and we'll talk about that. And then one other remedy we'll look at today is criminal vacatur, which is a state level mechanism that helps a survivor clear their rap sheet of certain criminal convictions. And what's really exciting about this field of law very recently was the passage of the START Act. And it used to be that survivors could, for the most part, only vacate or remove from their record prostitution-related convictions. Now, with the passage of the START Act, any criminal conviction is eligible to be removed from a survivor's rap sheet if they can show that they were a trafficking victim at the time of the committed crime. Right, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. But let's go back to victim witness cooperation. So victim witness cooperation is when a victim of a crime, and I'm using the word victim a lot here, and I'll just note something about language, is that victim is a legal term, and for many survivors, they experience victimization. But in practice, when we're working with a client, it's very much part of our practice to mirror whatever language the survivor or client feels most comfortable with. So I just wanted to drop that note about language because I'm using victim in its legal sense. So victim witness cooperation is when a victim of a crime shares information with a law enforcement body, as I mentioned, such as the FBI or a prosecutor's office, about the crimes committed against them. And that cooperation could mean one or more meetings or be participating throughout an investigation or prosecution of a perpetrator. So, or perhaps the client has already been approached by law enforcement and is electing to speak with them. So several things happen at that point, right? So let's say we are meeting a client and they are interested in potentially reporting, right? First and foremost, we have a conversation with our client about what their motivations and goals are so that we can both create collaboration and we as attorneys can best serve the client's interests. And it's really up to the client to determine what their goals are, and we serve the client, right? So clients may have more or just one or many reasons why they want to share what happened to them with law enforcement. And that can include they are seeking protection from the government. They're seeking justice or saying, I don't want him to do to someone else what he did to me. The client may have been approached affirmatively by law enforcement, or maybe they're comporting with an immigration requirement, or maybe they really want criminal restitution or just to have her day in court. Whatever those motives are and their goals, we respect and assist the client in trying to achieve them. Second, we determine who's it best to report to. Should we talk to state or federal police? Right? Making this decision is actually quite complex and requires a conversation that is best informed by understanding our client's goals and motivations that we talked about earlier. So lastly, in our capacity as victim witness attorneys, we liaise with law enforcement and accompany clients to all cooperation meetings. And representing clients in these meetings ensures that clients' rights are protected and their goals and interests asserted, that they feel supported, right? That someone's in their corner in what could be a very overwhelming and potentially triggering environment. And so for our clients who may or may have not had experiences in the past with the criminal justice system, no matter what, clients will feel really nervous about that interaction. And having somebody that they know is in their corner that represents their rights and interests is tremendously helpful, not only for the survivor, but for the law enforcement agents as well, knowing that they have a skilled professional in the room that could help the survivor to navigate a really difficult process, right? So we'll be going into more depth about that on part 2 of our webinar, which is next week. And the last part of criminal justice advocacy I'll talk about is coming back to vacatur. So we know that when a victim is under control of a trafficker, it may not just be one crime they're forced to commit, right? So for example, I've worked with clients who were forced to engage in commercial sex, but maybe it's not just prostitution. Maybe they're forced to carry a weapon or carry drugs to bring on the dates, right? And maybe they get arrested, and maybe they have several arrests, or maybe pages on their rap sheet. Right. So thankfully in New York, and New York was the first state in the United States to have a vacatur law, well, we finally expanded it, right? To understand that oftentimes victims are forced to commit multiple kinds of criminal acts at the hands of their traffickers. And if they don't, they face often very severe consequences. So with the expanded law in New York, now trafficking survivors are able to bring state level motions to court to say, I committed these acts while under force and duress of my trafficker, and now I'm applying to have them completely removed from my record. This is so important, not just for justice and recognizing that a victim shouldn't be saddled with a rap sheet for acts that she committed while under duress, but it's also a huge logistic barrier, right? If you have crimes on your rap sheet, it's impossible to get housing or a job, right? Or if you're an immigrant applying for immigration remedies and this pops up, it could be a bar for several forms of relief. So the wonderful thing about vacatur, it's not even like expungement, it goes one better. It returns the person back to where they were before even being arrested, right? And like I said, if you're interested in learning more about that, we'll return to this next week on part 2 of the webinar. Okay. So slide 12, please. Okay. So folks always ask, so what can I do? What if it's happening to me? What if it's happening to someone that I know or love, right? So if you suspect that an adult that you know or love may be in a trafficking situation, never intervene on your own. because this could pose a significant danger for not only you, but the person in that situation, right? If you have access to that person and can speak openly and safely with them, our advice would be first, meet them where they are, meaning never project judgment. There may be many barriers, right? As we saw on that power and control wheel earlier, that keep a victim in their situation or from being able to leave their circumstance, like violence against them or their families or their children. There are so many complex dynamics at play, and your job as a friend or as a loved one is to approach with kindness and compassion, certainly not victim blaming and certainly not judgment, but empathy, right? Ask what you can do, if anything, to support them, and what does that support look like to them? You could perhaps help them to safety plan. For example, can this person memorize your phone number in case they need to call you in an emergency situation? Next slide, please. And I'm including some phone numbers here. Feel free to write them down. We'll leave this slide up for a little while. But if you think you yourself may have experienced trafficking, maybe you're not sure, maybe you know for sure, but you want to reach out to somebody or an attorney from our team, you can certainly call the Sanctuary for Families ATI hotline. So Sanctuary has a general hotline, and I think Aaliyah gave that phone number out at the beginning. That's the main line. We also have a separate hotline in ATI just for trafficking. And that number is 347-704-4500. And there's an outgoing message. You won't reach anyone on that phone number, but there's an outgoing message in English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. And you're able to leave a message in any language that you want. We have on our staff, just in ATI, folks who speak English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Japanese, Hebrew, and Arabic. And I think I've covered them all. But if we don't have a staff member on our team who speaks the language that you want to leave a message in, we also have access to a language line and can loop in an interpreter. And all you have to do is leave a time and a phone number that would be safe for you to have somebody contact you. And lastly, you can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That phone number is there, 888-373-7888, and they are nationwide. So maybe you're listening in and know of somebody who's in a trafficking situation, perhaps in Florida or Baltimore. You can call this line, and the national hotline will contact service providers. Sanctuary for Families is one of the providers on their list to assist with crises, housing issues, need for legal assistance, pretty much anything. They will report out to service providers from there. They also have a text number, which I am sorry I failed to put in the PowerPoint slide, but I can read it off. If you text star to the phone number 233-733, and I'll just repeat that, 233-733.